We called it a break from the world, an adventure to clear our heads. Just the four of us. Me, Noah, Liv, and her boyfriend, Marco. We'd been best friends since college, and for years we'd talked about taking a hiking trip together. When Liv found a remote mountain range in the middle of nowhere, we were sold. It had no cell service, no nearby towns, just pure, untouched wilderness. The locals, however, had a different name for it: the Silent Peaks. Noah joked that it sounded like something out of a horror movie, but I brushed it off. I had always loved the eerie kind of silence that blanketed the mountains. The stillness, the sense that you were completely alone with nothing but the trees and the wind. But when we finally got there, I understood why the silence had a reputation. From the moment we started up the trail, the world grew unnaturally quiet. There were no bird calls, no rustling in the trees, no distant hum of civilization. It was a silence so deep it felt like a presence pressing against us, filling our ears with nothing but the faint sound of our own footsteps. "Anyone else finding this a little creepy?" Liv whispered, her voice barely above a breath, as if afraid of disturbing the quiet. "Just the atmosphere," Marco replied with a shrug, trying to sound confident, though I could see the unease flicker in his eyes. "Besides, it's nice not having the noise from the city for once." But even he seemed to feel it, that heavy, watchful silence that seemed to follow us like a shadow. We hiked all day, barely speaking, our voices muffled by the thick fog that blanketed the trees. By the time we set up camp, the sun was low, casting the forest in shades of blue and gray. We set up our tents on a flat patch of ground overlooking a steep ravine, the drop disappearing into the mist below. As night fell, the quiet became almost unbearable. We huddled around a small campfire, its light barely penetrating the thickening fog. Marco was trying to lighten the mood, telling a story about some frat party we'd all gone to years ago, but his voice seemed to fade, swallowed by the silence. It was then that we heard it, a faint echo drifting through the trees like a ghostly whisper. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to listen, my mind struggling to make sense of the sound. It was too soft to recognize, too distant to pinpoint, but it had a rhythm to it, almost like footsteps. "You guys hear that?" I whispered, glancing around the campfire. Noah nodded, his eyes wide, his face pale in the firelight. "Probably just someone else on the trail," he said, though his voice wavered. "Who would be out here at this hour?" Liv muttered, her gaze flickering nervously to the darkness surrounding us. The footsteps stopped, leaving us in an even deeper silence, as though the mountain itself were holding its breath. We tried to laugh it off, chalk it up to paranoia, but I could see the tension in everyone's faces, the way they glanced nervously at the shadows. When we finally crawled into our tents, the silence felt even heavier, pressing in around us, filling the empty spaces with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The next morning I woke up early, the pale light of dawn casting a gray glow over the campsite. Noah was already up, sitting by the remains of the fire, his face drawn and tired. "You hear anything weird last night?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, the memory of the footsteps sending a chill down my spine. "Do you think it was just someone else out here?" "Maybe." He didn't sound convinced, and we spent the morning packing up camp, everyone on edge, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to see someone, or something, watching us from the trees. As we hiked deeper into the mountains, the fog grew thicker, swallowing the path ahead and muffling our footsteps until it felt like we were walking through a dream. Around noon, we stumbled upon an old campsite, half hidden in the mist. The tents were torn, their fabric weathered and shredded, as though they had been left there for years. Rusted cans and empty water bottles littered the ground, covered in a thin layer of dirt and moss. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," Marco muttered, poking one of the tents with his foot. Liv crouched down, picking up a crumpled photograph lying half buried in the dirt. She brushed off the dirt, squinting at the image. It was faded and water-stained, but I could just make out the figures of two people, a man and a woman, their faces obscured by the glare of the camera flash. "Maybe they got lost," Liv said, her voice barely a whisper. "Or maybe they heard what we heard last night." The thought sent a shiver through me, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching us. But the forest was empty, the silence pressing down around us like a weight. We left the campsite in a hurry, not wanting to linger, but the feeling of being watched followed us, growing stronger with each step. That night, the fog was so thick we could barely see each other, the campfire little more than a faint glow in the mist. The silence was even deeper, the air heavy with an almost oppressive weight. We sat around the fire, our voices low, each of us glancing nervously at the shadows. "Maybe we should head back tomorrow," Noah said, breaking the silence. "This place, it's not normal." Marco scoffed, trying to sound brave, but even he looked uneasy. "It's just fog and a creepy story. We'll be fine." But as the words left his mouth, the footsteps started again. They were louder this time, closer, the sound echoing through the trees in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like something was pacing just out of sight. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to see through the fog. Is someone there?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then a voice drifted through the mist, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. "Help, please." The voice was soft, broken, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. It sounded close, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thick wall of fog. "Who's there?" Liv called, her voice shaking. "Are you hurt?" But there was no answer, just the sound of footsteps moving away, fading into the silence. We spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, too afraid to sleep, our ears straining for any sound. But the footsteps didn't return, and by morning we convinced ourselves it had been a trick of the fog, our minds playing tricks on us. But deep down I knew it was real. As we continued up the mountain, the fog grew even thicker, the path narrowing until we were forced to walk single file. The silence was so deep it was almost suffocating, filling my ears with a dull, pressing weight. Every now and then I thought I heard faint whispers drifting through the trees, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By late afternoon we stumbled upon another abandoned campsite. This one was older, the tents nothing more than rotting fabric clinging to broken poles. And on the ground, half buried in the dirt, was a shoe, small and scuffed like it had belonged to a child. "We're not alone out here," Noah said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I shivered, a growing sense of dread gnawing at my stomach. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no recent fires, just empty campsites, scattered along the trail like silent warnings. That night we set up camp in a small clearing, the fog so thick we could barely see each other's faces. We sat in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows on the trees, each of us too afraid to speak. And then the footsteps started again. This time they were close. Closer than ever, the sound echoing through the trees in a slow, deliberate rhythm. I felt my heart race, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body frozen in place, trapped in the grip of terror. The footsteps stopped, and a voice drifted through the fog, soft and broken. "Why did you come here?" It was a whisper, barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. I glanced at the others, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Who are you?" Marco called, his voice shaking. But there was no answer, just the silence, deep and suffocating, pressing down on us like a weight. And then I saw it, a figure barely visible through the fog, standing just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, its features hidden in shadow, its body twisted and unnatural, like something that didn't quite belong. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate, its eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Why did you come here?" it repeated, its voice a hollow echo that sent a chill through my bones. We stumbled back, grabbing our things, our minds screaming at us to run. But as we turned, the fog thickened, swallowing the path, leaving us trapped in a wall of white. And in the distance I could hear it, the sound of footsteps moving closer, closing in around us, as if the mountain itself had come alive, intent on keeping us here, lost and forgotten. As we stumbled through the fog, our voices fading, our memories slipping, I realized the truth. The silent peaks weren't silent, they were full of echoes, the voices of those who had come before, those who had lost their way, their souls trapped in the fog, forever calling out, forever searching. And now we were a part of it. It began as simple insomnia, something I assumed would pass. A few nights of restlessness, staring at the ceiling, my mind circling the same pointless thoughts. I'd always been a light sleeper, the kind to wake at the slightest sound. But this was different. My mind wouldn't shut off. My body refused to relax. And night after night, I'd lie there, counting the hours until morning. My skin prickled, my thoughts raced, and with every sleepless night, my sense of reality seemed to fray just a little. The insomnia stretched from days to weeks, and soon I felt like a ghost moving through my own life. Friends began to notice, my co-workers avoided my gaze, and my boss even pulled me aside one afternoon, concern plain on his face. "Natalie," he said gently, his voice lowered, "you look off. Maybe you should get some help. This can't go on forever." The comment stung, but he was right. My life had become a hollow routine. Work, home, the cold sheets waiting for me at night. I was exhausted, dragging myself through each day, my thoughts hazy, my mind slowly unraveling. When I finally made the decision to look for help, it was out of sheer desperation. I needed sleep, real sleep, before my mind gave out completely. I'd heard about sleep clinics before, places where specialists tracked your brain waves, gave advice, handed out pills if necessary. But then I found Sundown Sleep Solutions. Sundown was different. Its website was professional, sleek, filled with smiling people lounging on beds, their faces bright with relief. But what really drew me in was a page about their experimental therapy program, a specialized treatment designed for chronic insomniacs who hadn't found relief with traditional methods. They advertised it as cutting edge, promising results that seemed almost too good to be true. That night I sat on my couch, my laptop's light illuminating my tired face, reading every word on the page. The words felt strangely magnetic, like they were speaking directly to me. They described everything I felt. The isolation, the exhaustion, the feeling of slipping away from reality. And they made a promise. With the experimental therapy program, I would experience sleep unlike any I had ever known. The application form was long, almost invasive, asking for details about my sleep habits, my medical history, my memories, even details of recent dreams. I filled it all out, feeling as if I were exposing parts of myself that hadn't seen the light in years. I hit submit and leaned back, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. When my phone rang a few hours later, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered, my curiosity overpowering my exhaustion. "Natalie, is it?" The voice on the other end was calm, soothing, with a faint accent I couldn't place. "This is Dr. Renaud from Sundown Sleep Solutions. I wanted to speak with you directly regarding our experimental therapy program." "Oh," I stammered, surprised. "Thank you. I wasn't expecting a call this late." "Apologies," Dr. Renaud said, her voice smooth and steady. "Our program operates at night. Many of our treatments are administered after dark. This is the first step in adjusting your body to a new sleep rhythm." Her tone was gentle but firm, and I felt myself relaxing, as if lulled by her words. She asked me about my insomnia, her questions careful and deliberate, and with each answer I felt like she was probing deeper, peeling back layers I hadn't even realized were there. When I described the sense of unease that had started creeping into my nights, the feeling of not being alone, she didn't laugh or brush it off. "Many patients report that feeling," she said softly. "Our minds are complex, and Sleep is where we're most vulnerable. It is perfectly natural to feel as though you're not alone in your own mind. I assure you our program is designed to guide you through that." I paused, my stomach twisting with a nervous energy. "What exactly is involved in this program?" "It's a monitored therapy," she replied, her voice calm but carrying an air of authority. "We'll track your brain's activity during sleep, monitor your heart rate, breathing, and other patterns. There may be side effects, disorientation, some mild hallucinations, but you'll be safe, as long as you trust the process." It was a strange reassurance, but I found myself nodding as though she could see me. Her voice had a quality that quieted my mind, lulling me into a strange kind of peace. She explained that I would be staying overnight at the clinic for an extended period, my body fully monitored, my dreams tracked, even encouraged. At her words, the thought of sleep seemed almost within reach, and I felt a surge of hope. I agreed, and the next evening I found myself standing outside Sundown Sleep Solutions. The building was modern, yet somehow imposing. It sat alone on a quiet street, its tall, narrow windows glowing softly against the dark sky. The architecture felt clinical, almost sterile, the kind of place that looked cold, calculating, as if it were designed to hold secrets. Inside, the receptionist handed me a clipboard with a thick stack of forms. Most of it was standard: consent for monitoring, permission to record dreams, acknowledgement of potential side effects. But near the end, I noticed an unusual clause that sent a chill down my spine. Patient consents to all procedures and waives the right to terminate therapy until the program's completion. I hesitated, my eyes lingering on the words, my mind filled with questions. But before I could overthink it, I signed my name and handed back the clipboard. The receptionist smiled and directed me to a waiting area, where a nurse escorted me down a long hallway to my room. Dr. Renaud appeared moments later, her face calm, her gaze steady. She had a serene quality about her, as though nothing could surprise or unsettle her. She led me to a small room at the end of the hall, her hand resting gently on my shoulder as we walked. "This will be your space during the program," she said, gesturing around the room. It was sparse, almost clinical, with walls painted a muted gray, a narrow bed with crisp white sheets, and a monitor mounted on the wall. A series of electrodes and wires were neatly arranged on a tray beside the bed, waiting to be attached. "You'll sleep here every night," Dr. Renaud continued, her voice soft. "Our therapy will allow you to reach deeper sleep states, ones that most people never experience." The words were strangely unsettling, but I forced a smile, reminding myself that this was what I'd wanted: to finally, truly, sleep. Dr. Renaud attached the electrodes to my scalp, her fingers gentle but cool. I lay back on the bed, feeling the hum of the monitor beneath me, its soft vibrations settling my nerves. As she left, she turned back one last time, her gaze intense. "Remember, Natalie," she said, her voice low, "whatever you experience, it's part of the process. It's essential that you don't resist it." I nodded, though her words left a strange weight in my chest, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. I closed my eyes, my body sinking into the mattress, and listened to the soft hum of the monitor, its rhythm steady, almost like a heartbeat. I felt myself drifting, slipping into sleep, the kind of sleep I hadn't felt in years. And then, without warning, I was gone. The dream was unsettling from the start. I found myself in a hallway, dimly lit and narrow, stretching endlessly in both directions. Doors lined the walls on either side, each identical with small plaques bearing names. I couldn't make out the names, but they seemed familiar, as though they belonged to people I knew, or should have known. I took a step forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and reached out to touch one of the doors. It was cold, the surface rough beneath my fingers. I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I continued down the hall, a strange sense of urgency building inside me, though I couldn't explain why. I felt watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as though someone, or something, were lurking just out of sight. I walked faster, my heart pounding, my eyes darting between the doors, searching for something, though I didn't know what. At the end of the hallway was a mirror. I caught sight of my reflection and froze. My face stared back at me, but it looked wrong. My eyes were sunken, dark circles smudged beneath them. My skin pale, almost sickly. I raised a hand, touching my face, and my reflection mirrored me. Its eyes hollow, its movements just a fraction too slow. "Natalie." The voice was barely a whisper, a faint echo that sent chills down my spine. I turned, searching for the source, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. Only the empty hallway stretched behind me, silent and endless. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding, my body drenched in cold sweat. The monitor beside my bed beeped softly, displaying a series of patterns I didn't recognize, but they looked strange, almost human. As though faces were hidden within the lines, staring out at me, twisted and distorted. I lay there, my mind racing, the memory of the dream vivid and real, as though I'd actually been there, walking down that endless hall. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows watching me. But I was alone. The door opened and Dr. Renaud stepped inside, her expression calm, her gaze thoughtful. "Did you dream?" she asked, her voice steady. I hesitated, then nodded, describing the hallway, the strange, haunted feeling, the mirror. She listened intently, her face unreadable, though I thought I saw a flicker of interest in her eyes. "Dreams are the mind's way of processing," she said slowly. "Sometimes they show us things we're not ready to see, or things we don't want to admit." "It felt, too real," I murmured, my hands shaking. "Like I was actually there." She offered a small smile, a strange light glinting in her eyes. "Trust the process, Natalie. In time, all of this will make sense." With that, she left, closing the door softly behind her, leaving me alone with the silence, the memory of the dream, and the strange feeling that I was being watched. And as I lay there, staring into the shadows, I realized something unsettling. The dream hadn't ended. Some part of me was still in that hallway, still walking, still searching. And the further I drifted from myself, the harder it became to tell which world was real. The next day felt like moving through water. My thoughts were slow, foggy, weighed down by the lingering images of the hallway, of my own hollow-eyed reflection. It was strange. Usually a vivid dream would fade, slipping away with the morning light, but this one clung to me, sharp and clear. I could still feel the rough texture of the walls under my fingertips, hear the echo of my own footsteps in the silence. The clinic had a strict routine, but it was designed to be calming, almost too calming. The hallways were always dimly lit, quiet as a tomb, and the staff moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. Each time I passed a staff member, I felt their eyes linger on me a beat too long, their gazes unreadable. Dr. Renaud appeared that evening, her face as serene as ever, her presence quiet but commanding. She led me back to the room with the bed, the monitor, the electrodes waiting to be attached. Her words from the night before echoed in my mind. "It's essential that you don't resist it." "Tonight we'll go deeper," she said, her hands gentle as she attached the electrodes to my scalp. "The therapy works best when your mind is fully open, when you allow it to pull from your unconscious." I nodded, though my stomach twisted with a strange sense of foreboding. "What exactly are you trying to pull out of my unconscious?" She paused, her fingers still, her gaze flickering to meet mine. "We're trying to access what keeps you from rest, Natalie. The memories, the thoughts, the things you've buried that are unresolved." It sounded clinical, reassuring, but something in her voice, in the way her eyes lingered on me, made me feel like she was leaving something out. Once she left, I lay back on the bed, the monitor's low hum filling the room, its rhythm familiar, almost comforting. I focused on the sound, letting it carry me down, my mind drifting until I felt myself slipping into sleep. This time the dream came faster, more vivid. I was back in the hallway, only now it was darker, the walls lined with flickering lights that cast strange shadows across the floor. The air was thick, heavy, filled with a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. I walked forward, my footsteps silent, as if I were floating. Each door I passed bore a name, but the plaques were blurred, the letters shifting and changing, impossible to read. I reached out, running my hand along the wall, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingers, and felt a strange sense of familiarity, as though I'd walked this hall many times before. At the end of the hall, the mirror waited, its surface dull, cracked, barely reflecting the dim light. I approached it slowly, a cold dread settling over me, but I couldn't stop myself. I leaned forward, peering into the glass, and saw myself staring back. But it wasn't really me. The reflection was pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. I reached out, touching the glass, and felt a shock, like electricity, pulsing through my fingers. My reflection's eyes widened, her mouth moving, forming words I couldn't hear. "Natalie." The voice was a whisper, soft and broken, echoing around me, but there was something familiar about it, something that sent chills down my spine. "Natalie, help me." I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the voice only grew louder, filling the hallway, the walls pressing in around me. I turned, searching for a way out, but the doors were locked, the handles cold and unyielding beneath my grip. I pounded on the doors, my fist slamming against the wood, but the sound was swallowed by the silence. And then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hall, moving closer. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my body paralyzed with fear. The footsteps grew louder, each one sending a jolt of terror through me until I could feel them right behind me. A shadow pressing close, a presence so cold it burned. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could feel it watching me. Feel its breath on the back of my neck, its fingers reaching out, brushing against my shoulder. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The room was dark, the monitor casting a faint glow, its screen flickering with patterns I didn't recognize, strange shapes twisting and writhing across the display. I stared at it, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing, but the shapes looked familiar, like faces, distorted and hollow, staring out at me through the screen. The door opened and Dr. Renault stepped inside, her expression calm, though her eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't read. "Another dream?" she asked, her voice steady. I nodded, my hands shaking as I described the hallway, the mirror, the footsteps. She listened, her gaze thoughtful, her fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the edge of the bed. "Dreams are the mind's way of processing," she said finally. "They show us things we may not want to see, things we may not even recognize in ourselves. It's perfectly natural to feel unsettled." But it felt so real, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Like I was actually there. She offered a small smile, a strange light glinting in her eyes. "Trust the process, Natalie. In time, all of this will make sense." She left, closing the door behind her, leaving me alone with the silence, the memory of the dream, and the strange feeling that I was being watched. I sat there for a long time, staring at the monitor, the shapes on the screen shifting, forming patterns that looked disturbingly like faces. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But as I lay back, the memory of those cold, deliberate footsteps echoed in my mind, a feeling of dread settling in my chest. And as I drifted off, I realized something unsettling. The dream hadn't ended. The library was my sanctuary. After years of reading in coffee shops and cramped apartments, I finally landed my dream job as the night librarian at Blackwood University Library. It was a sprawling, Gothic building with towering shelves, hidden alcoves, and enough dusty volumes to last me a lifetime. The library had been built in the late 1800s, and the architecture still bore the marks of its time. Gargoyles perched on corners, elaborate woodwork along the ceilings, and winding corridors that led to who knows where. I had the place to myself from midnight to 8 a.m. Most people found the idea of working alone in a massive, dark library unnerving, but I relished it. I loved the quiet, the smell of old paper, and the thought that I was surrounded by stories, some forgotten, just waiting for someone to discover them again. It was about 3 weeks into the job when I first noticed something odd. I was organizing the rare book section, deep in the bowels of the library, where the shelves towered over me, and the lights barely reached the corners. I had a strange feeling like I was being watched. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty, save for the rows and rows of books, their spines cracked and faded with age. Shaking it off as paranoia, I turned back to my work. But that's when I saw it, a door at the far end of the room, half hidden in the shadows. I hadn't noticed it before, and it seemed out of place, slightly ajar, as if someone had just slipped inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it slowly. There was no handle, just a simple brass plate that read, "Restricted Access." I hesitated, but the door seemed to be inviting me, like it had been waiting for someone to notice it. I slipped inside. The room beyond was small, barely more than a closet, with walls lined with old filing cabinets and shelves filled with dusty boxes. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and something else, something metallic and faintly sour. There was no light inside, so I pulled out my phone, the beam of the flashlight casting eerie shadows across the walls. I walked to the first cabinet, my fingers brushing against the cool metal. Each drawer was labeled in neat, precise handwriting, listing years that spanned back more than a century. I opened one of the drawers, my fingers trembling slightly, and found folders filled with yellowing papers, each one covered in handwriting that looked spidery and frantic. The first folder was labeled December 1902. I opened it carefully, the brittle paper crackling under my fingers. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all written by someone named Arthur Shaw, addressed to a woman named Eleanor. But as I read through the letters, a strange chill washed over me. The letters were filled with desperate pleas, fragmented thoughts, ramblings about the Watcher in the shadows and the secrets of the archive. The words were scrawled messily, the ink smudged, as though they had been written in a hurry, as though Arthur had been afraid of something. Eleanor, one of the letters began, I fear I have found something in the archive that I was not meant to see. There are things hidden here, secrets that the walls themselves seem to whisper. I can hear them even now, their voices echoing in the dark. I beg you, do not come here. The archive holds something that watches. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly placed the letter back in the folder, my hand shaking. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just an old letter from a time when people believed in ghosts and superstitions. But as I reached for the next folder, a strange noise broke the silence. A faint rustling, like someone turning the pages of a book. I froze, my heart pounding, listening intently. The sound seemed to be coming from just outside the door. I turned off my phone's flashlight, my hand gripping the cold metal of the cabinet. The rustling continued, closer now, echoing in the small room as though someone or something was standing just beyond the door. I held my breath, my mind racing, but when the rustling stopped, I waited a few seconds longer, then exhaled, feeling a rush of relief. It was just an old building, I told myself. The wind, the creaking walls, all of it was perfectly explainable. But as I stepped out of the room, a single piece of paper lay on the floor just outside the door. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up, my heart pounding, and read the first line. To whomever may read this, know that the archive is alive and it remembers. I stared at the words, feeling a strange sense of dread. I'd heard of haunted houses, haunted libraries even, but a haunted archive. The idea was absurd. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the library had secrets, hidden memories, and now they'd noticed me. I returned to my desk, but I couldn't focus on the cataloging I was supposed to do. My mind kept drifting back to the letter, to the strange noises, to the words that seemed to be warning me of something dark lurking within the library. That night, as I was locking up, I heard footsteps echoing down one of the hallways. I called out, assuming it was security, or perhaps one of the students who had stayed late. But there was no response. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as though someone was pacing just out of sight, waiting for me to leave. I gathered my things and hurried out, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes watching me as I walked down the dimly lit hallway. But as I reached the front doors, I saw something in the glass reflection. A shadow standing at the end of the hallway, unmoving, its shape twisted and unnatural. I turned, but the hallway was empty. The shadow had vanished. The next night, I couldn't resist going back to the hidden room. The memory of those letters, the strange noises, the shadow in the hallway, they gnawed at me, filling me with a mix of fear and fascination. I needed to know what was hidden in the archive, what Arthur Shaw had discovered all those years ago. I entered the room, my flashlight casting eerie shadows across the walls. I opened another drawer, this one labeled June 1910, and found more letters, these addressed to a man named James Holloway. The letters were written in the same frantic handwriting, filled with warnings about the archive's secrets and the watcher within. But as I reached for the last letter in the folder, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense of dread, of being watched. I turned and my flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move, to shift, as though the walls themselves were breathing. I felt something brush against my arm, a cold, invisible hand, and I dropped the letter, my heart pounding. I stumbled back, my hand brushing against the metal cabinet, and in the dim light I saw a faint outline, a face twisted and hollow, staring at me from within the metal. The face vanished as my flashlight stabilized, but the feeling of dread remained, the sense that I had disturbed something that had been waiting in the dark for far too long. I backed out of the room, leaving the drawer open, and hurried back to my desk, my mind racing. I told myself it was all in my head, that it was just the atmosphere of the place, the late hours, the eerie quiet. But deep down I knew there was more to it. As I reached my desk, a single book lay open on the surface. I hadn't left it there, and it hadn't been there when I'd left. The pages were filled with spidery handwriting, the ink smudged as though someone had been writing in haste. The words on the page sent a chill down my spine. The archive remembers. The secrets are not forgotten. They are waiting, patient as the dust, as the silence. And now, you have seen them. The library was silent, the shadows pressing in around me. But as I looked around, I felt it, the weight of something ancient, something that had been watching for decades, maybe longer. And I realized with a growing sense of horror that I was no longer alone. Over the next few nights, I tried to ignore the strange occurrences. I told myself it was stress, paranoia, the result of working long hours alone. But the sounds grew louder, the faint rustling, the soft whispers, the footsteps that followed me down the empty hallways. The archive was watching me, and each night it seemed to draw closer, the walls pressing in, the shadows stretching longer. One night, as I was shelving books in the farthest corner of the library, I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned, but no one was there. Only a single sheet of paper lay on the floor, covered in the same spidery handwriting. The secrets are yours now, but secrets have a way of keeping themselves. The words seemed to twist, the ink smudging, the letters shifting as though they were alive, moving on the page. And as I backed away, I realized something with a cold, sinking dread. The archive wasn't just a place, it was alive, a thing of memory and shadow, a keeper of secrets that wanted nothing more than to be left alone. But it was too late. I had found it, and now it would never let me go. It was a Saturday afternoon when I found it. A garage sale on the edge of town, the kind that looks more like a dump than a sale, with old furniture stacked in the yard, books strewn across a tarp, and broken electronics piled in a dusty box. I was about to leave when I spotted it. An old video game console, the kind with chunky buttons and a scratched screen, tucked under a stack of VHS tapes. I wasn't much of a gamer, but the console had a nostalgic appeal. It looked just like the ones I'd played as a kid, with bright green buttons and a cartridge slot that was slightly off-center. Something about it drew me in, an old half-forgotten thrill from years ago. There was no label, no markings, just the name, printed in block letters on a plain black cartridge. Midnight Game. I asked the old man running the sale about it, but he just shrugged, muttering something about a strange one, and not meant for most folks. I laughed it off, assuming it was just a piece of junk, but for $5 I figured it was worth a try. Maybe it would even work. When I got home, I set up the console in the living room, plugging it into my old TV. The screen flickered to life, bright and almost too loud, filling the room with an eerie, static hum. A simple title screen appeared, the words Midnight Game flickering in faded white letters, the edges pixelated and uneven. The background was a shadowy landscape, a house barely visible against a night sky. I pressed start. The game opened with a first-person perspective, my character standing at the entrance of an old abandoned house. The graphics were dated, grainy, but somehow unsettling in their simplicity. The game had no instructions, no tutorials. It was just me standing in front of this house, the screen dark and ominous, with a single objective: enter. The house loomed in front of me, tall and imposing, its windows broken, the door slightly ajar. The graphics flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of unease, but I shrugged it off. It was just a game, after all. I pressed forward, guiding my character through the door. Inside, the house was even darker, the rooms empty and echoing. The only sound was the soft creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of static from the TV. The screen flickered again, and a message appeared at the top. "Welcome, player." A shiver ran down my spine, but I pushed it aside, moving my character forward. The objective was simple enough: explore the house. I wandered through room after room, each one more shadowed and eerie than the last. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of the screen, a shadow flickering past. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. After about 10 minutes, a new objective appeared on the screen. Find the key. I searched each room, feeling a growing sense of dread, though I couldn't explain why. It was just a game, after all. But the longer I played, the more real it felt. The shadows pressing closer, the silence filling the room. I found the key in an upstairs bedroom tucked under a dusty old bed and brought it to the front door, expecting the game to end. But as I unlocked the door, a new message appeared. Congratulations, player, level 1 complete. The screen faded to black, and when it returned, I was back at the front door, the same house looming in front of me. But this time, something was different. The windows were darker, the door closed, the sky outside a deep bruised shade of purple. I shrugged, assuming it was just part of the game's design, and pressed forward. By the time I reached level 3, I started to feel that strange. Each level was the same: find the key, unlock the door, repeat. But each time, the house grew darker, the rooms more decayed. Shadows moved at the edge of the screen, flickering just out of reach, and the whispers. I could hear faint whispers echoing through the house, like someone calling my name, but distorted, twisted. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, snapping me out of the trance, and I glanced at the time, my eyes widening. It was past midnight. I'd been playing for hours, yet it felt like no time at all. I reached for the remote, my thumb hovering over the off button, but something made me hesitate. The game felt unfinished, as though it was calling me, pulling me deeper. I took a deep breath, my hand shaking, and pressed continue. Level 4 was different. The house was darker, the walls covered in strange symbols, words scrawled in a language I didn't recognize. The whispers were louder now, a low, rhythmic chant that echoed through the rooms, filling the air with a sense of dread. I moved my character forward, my heart pounding, every nerve on edge. Find the mirror, the objective read. I made my way through the house, my hands trembling as I guided my character up a set of crumbling stairs. Each step echoed through the empty rooms, the screen flickering with static. I found the mirror at the end of a narrow hallway, its surface cracked, the reflection dim and distorted. I leaned closer, watching my character's reflection, my own face staring back at me through the screen. But as I watched, my reflection began to change. The eyes darkened, the skin paling, the mouth twisting into a cruel, knowing smile. My heart pounded, a cold chill running down my spine. And then the reflection spoke. You're getting closer. The words sent a shiver through me, my stomach twisting with a strange sense of fear. I tried to move my character away from the mirror, but the screen froze, the reflection staring at me unblinking, its eyes dark and empty. And then the screen went black. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I reached for the console, ready to turn it off, but the screen flickered back to life, the game restarting on its own. The house was there, darker than before, the sky outside pitch black. Level 5. Survive. The message sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't stop myself. I pressed forward, guiding my character through the house, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to stop playing. But I couldn't. The house was different now, the walls pulsing, the whispers louder, filling my mind, echoing around me. I felt like I was slipping, like I was losing control. The game pulling me deeper, its world seeping into my own. And then I heard it. A faint knock on my front door, echoing through the silence. I froze, my heart pounding, the sound echoing through the room. I glanced at the screen, but the game had frozen, my character trapped in the middle of the hallway, the whispers louder, almost deafening. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I stood slowly, my hands shaking, and made my way to the door. I glanced through the peephole, but there was no one there, only the empty hallway, the lights flickering. I opened the door, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty, silent. When I returned to the living room, the game was gone. The screen was blank, the console turned off as though it had never been there. I stared at the TV, my mind reeling, my heart pounding. I reached for the power button, but the screen remained dark, unresponsive. And then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, my breath catching as I saw a message from an unknown number. Level 6, run. My heart skipped a beat, fear twisting in my stomach. I glanced around the room, the silence pressing down on me, the shadows stretching longer. I backed away, my mind racing, but the message remained, the words flickering on the screen, taunting me. And then I heard it. a soft whisper echoing through the room, the same voice from the game calling my name. I ran, grabbing my keys and stumbling out of the apartment, my heart pounding, my mind racing. But as I reached the street, I saw something in the distance. A figure standing under the streetlight, its face hidden in shadow, its gaze fixed on me. It raised a hand pointing toward me, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine, a sense of dread so intense it made my skin crawl. And then the figure vanished, leaving only the silence, the empty street, and the knowledge that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the game wasn't over, and it never would be. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream. My hand still shook as I reached for my phone, but when I checked the messages, the text was gone. No trace of it. And yet, every time I closed my eyes, I could still see those words burned into my mind. Level 6. Run. I decided to put the whole thing behind me, chalking it up to a bad night, maybe even a sleepwalking episode. But the console was still there, sitting on my coffee table, the blank screen facing me like an accusation. I unplugged it, wrapped it in a blanket, and stuffed it in the back of my closet. I was done. I'd moved on. Or so I thought. 2 nights later, just as I was falling asleep, I heard the knock. It was the same knock I'd heard while playing the game, the same slow, rhythmic knock that sent a chill through my bones. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, straining to hear, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. I reached for my phone, the screen blinding me in the dark, but there were no messages, no missed calls. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread, reminding myself that I'd put the game away, hidden it. It couldn't be affecting me anymore. I lay back down, pulling the covers over my head, but the knock came again, louder, echoing through the silence. I didn't sleep that night, and the following morning I found myself standing in front of my closet, staring at the spot where I'd hidden the console. I told myself I wouldn't open it, that I'd throw it away, maybe even burn it. But something stopped me, a strange pull that I couldn't explain. I reached in, pulling the console from the pile of blankets. It was cold, heavier than I remembered, the plastic rough under my fingertips. For a moment, I hesitated, my mind racing. But then I shook my head, determined to end this once and for all. I stuffed it in a trash bag, tied it tight, and walked out to the alley behind my building. I tossed it into the dumpster, feeling a strange sense of relief as the bag hit the bottom with a dull thud. It was over. Or so I thought. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, the lights flickered. The sound of static crackled through my apartment, low at first, then growing louder, filling the room. I turned, glancing at the TV in the living room. It was on, the screen flickering with static, though I hadn't touched it since morning. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, watching as the static began to clear, forming faint, shadowy shapes. And then, the words appeared on the screen, white letters against the black void. "Welcome back, player." My breath caught in my throat, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I'd thrown it away, I told myself. I'd gotten rid of the console. But as I stared at the screen, I realized that whatever I'd let into my life wasn't bound to a physical object. It was here, in my apartment, in my mind, and it wasn't going to let me go. The screen flickered, the words disappearing, replaced by a new message. Level 6. Survive. The lights in the apartment went out, plunging the room into darkness. I froze, my heart pounding, the static from the TV filling my ears, growing louder, almost deafening. I reached for my phone, fumbling for the flashlight, but when I turned it on, the light flickered, the screen flashing with a single notification. Unknown number, run. I didn't think. I bolted for the door, grabbing my keys, my mind screaming at me to get as far away as possible. But as I reached the hallway, the world seemed to shift, the walls twisting, the floor stretching out in front of me like a distorted mirror. I could still hear the static, faint but present, like it was following me, filling the air with its low, haunting hum. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, my heart pounding, but the street was empty, silent. The sky was dark, the streetlights casting long, twisted shadows across the pavement. I looked around, half expecting to see someone or something watching me, but there was only silence, the quiet pressing down on me like a weight. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the street, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, its face hidden, its body unnaturally still, as though it were waiting for me. I took a step back, my mind racing, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground, my body frozen in place. The figure took a step forward, the shadows shifting around it, its movements slow and deliberate. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice caught in my throat as the figure drew closer, its face still obscured, its presence filling me with a deep primal fear. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, I heard it. "You can't stop playing." The words echoed in my mind, twisting through my thoughts, filling me with a sense of dread so intense it felt like ice in my veins. I turned and ran, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me, keeping pace, never slowing. I didn't stop until I reached a crowded cafe, the noise and light flooding over me, breaking the spell. I stumbled inside, collapsing into a chair, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. The people around me barely glanced my way, absorbed in their own worlds, unaware of the terror that had just unfolded. I checked my phone, half expecting to see another message, but the screen was blank. No notifications, no missed calls. It was as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. Over the next few days, the messages stopped, the whispers fading, the static gone. I started to believe that maybe it was over, that I'd escaped whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. But the feeling of being watched never left. I could feel it in the quiet moments, in the shadows that stretched across my apartment, in the way my reflection seemed just a little too still, too knowing. And then one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed. I grabbed it, my heart pounding, and saw a single message, the words clear and taunting. "Level 7, obey." I threw the phone across the room, the screen cracking against the wall, but the message remained. The words burned into my mind. I couldn't escape it, couldn't shake the feeling that I was still playing, that the game was far from over. I tried to ignore it, to go about my life as though everything was normal. But the messages kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last, each one pulling me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. I started seeing things in the corner of my vision, shadows that moved on their own, figures that disappeared when I turned to look. My reflection seemed to watch me, its eyes dark and hollow, a twisted smile playing at the corners of its mouth. One night, as I was lying in bed, the TV turned on by itself, the screen flickering with static. I sat up, my heart racing, and saw the words appear, bold and stark against the darkness. "Final level. Surrender." The room went cold, the air thick with the scent of something metallic, sharp and unnatural. I tried to move, to get up, but my body wouldn't respond, trapped in place, the weight of the game pressing down on me, filling the room with its presence. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, its face obscured, its gaze fixed on me. It moved closer, slow and deliberate, its steps silent, its form shifting, twisting, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice lost in the silence, my body frozen as the figure leaned over me, its face inches from mine. Its eyes were dark, empty, its mouth a twisted smile that stretched too wide, too unnatural. And in a voice that was barely a whisper, it spoke, "The game never ends, player." The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a dread so deep it felt like it would consume me. The figure straightened, stepping back, and as it faded into the darkness, I realized with a sickening certainty that I was trapped, bound to the game, unable to escape. The screen went black, the static fading, the room falling silent. And in that silence I understood, and I was still playing, and I always would be. Dr. Peter Evans had seen plenty of challenging cases. Specializing in trauma and extreme phobias, he was no stranger to people's worst fears, their anxieties surfacing as vivid dreams, relentless paranoia, or behaviors they couldn't explain or control. He'd treated patients who wouldn't leave their homes, who feared their own shadows, who believed they were being hunted by invisible forces. But the case of Anna Kirkland would haunt him for the rest of his life. It began with a letter, delivered to his office one cold October afternoon. A handwritten envelope lay on his desk, unmarked by return address, sealed tightly. No one wrote letters anymore, so he assumed it was a thank you note from a patient. But when he opened it, the shaky handwriting and haunting message inside stopped him cold. "Dr. Evans," it began, I've heard you're the best there is at helping people who are afraid. I need your help. My name is Anna Kirkland, and I don't think I have much time left." The letter went on to describe symptoms that puzzled him. Anna wrote about seeing shadowy figures, dark shapes that flickered in her peripheral vision, always gone the moment she looked. She described feelings of dread that worsened by the day, that never let up even in sleep. Worst of all, she felt watched, as though something followed her constantly. A dark presence she couldn't escape. "It's not in my mind, Dr. Evans," the letter continued. "It's real. It's here with me, and I can feel it getting closer." The note ended with a final eerie instruction. "Come to room 306 at St. Mary's Sanatorium. I'll be waiting." Peter read the address twice, confusion twisting in his mind. St. Mary's had closed over 50 years ago. It was a crumbling, abandoned sanatorium, perched on the edge of town. People avoided it, warning each other with stories about strange sounds and unexplained lights seen in its broken windows. Yet here was a patient, pleading for his help, claiming to be waiting for him in a building that hadn't housed anyone in decades. Dr. Evans knew he should ignore it. The idea seemed absurd, the letter potentially the product of someone's delusion or a prank. But the words stayed with him. The tone of the letter was different from any cry for help he'd ever encountered. It was desperate, haunting. He couldn't shake the thought that this Anna Kirkland might be real, and she might truly be alone out there. Against his better judgment, he decided he'd go. After all, he was a psychologist, a skeptic by nature. It couldn't hurt to check, he reasoned. He'd drive up to the old building, prove to himself it was empty, and leave. But even as he made the decision, he felt an uneasy chill crawl up his spine, as though some deep part of him already knew this would be no ordinary visit. The sun was setting as Peter pulled up to St. Mary's Sanatorium. The building stood like a dark monolith against the sky, a grim silhouette of tall, narrow windows and cracked walls draped in ivy. It was a relic of a different era, its doors sealed and forgotten, the life that once filled its halls reduced to dust and silence. The wind howled as he stepped out of his car, sending a chill through him as he took in the imposing structure. Even from a distance he could feel the decay, the years of neglect that had turned the sanatorium into a monument of memories better left forgotten. The air was heavy, still, as if the very ground around him were holding its breath. Peter found the front doors unlocked, the chains hanging limply from the handles. Someone had broken in long ago, leaving the door slightly ajar. He hesitated, his hand hovering above the handle, a gnawing feeling of dread pooling in his stomach. The rational part of him wanted to turn back, to get in his car and forget this ever happened. But Anna's letter had done something to him, stirred something deep in his mind that refused to be ignored. Heck! With a steadying breath, he pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. Dust floated through the air like tiny ghosts, disturbed by his entrance. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty lobby, bouncing off the walls and disappearing down the dark hallways that stretched into the distance. He glanced down at the letter, his eyes tracing the words, Room 306. He'd have to find the stairs and make his way up to the third floor. The building seemed darker inside, the shadows stretching longer, each corner filled with a sense of unease. He shined his flashlight across the walls, the peeling paint and cracked tiles making the sanatorium look like a place frozen in time, left to decay in isolation. The halls were lined with old examination rooms, their doors hanging open, revealing crumbling equipment and shattered glass. Occasionally, he'd catch a glimpse of something, a shadow that flickered across the wall, the faint outline of what could have been a figure standing just beyond his line of sight. But when he looked, there was nothing there. He reached the stairs and began his ascent, the steps creaking under his weight, the sound echoing up and down the stairwell. As he climbed, the silence seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on him, filling his ears until he felt as though he were moving through water. Each step brought him closer to room 306, and with each step, his sense of dread deepened. Finally, he reached the third floor. The hall was darker here, the windows on this level completely covered in grime, blocking out the last traces of daylight. The air felt colder, and his flashlight barely seemed to cut through the gloom, illuminating only the immediate area around him. He walked down the hall, scanning the numbers on the doors, his heart pounding in his chest as he drew closer to room 306. When he found it, the door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness waiting beyond. His pulse quickened, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the handle. Slowly he pushed the door open, his flashlight casting a narrow beam across the room. Inside, the room was sparse and dark, the wallpaper peeled in large, curling sheets, and the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with mildew hung in the air. Against the far wall was a bed, its mattress bare, covered only by a thin sheet, and next to it a single chair. In that chair sat Anna. She was hunched over, her arms wrapped around herself, her head bowed, her body still as a statue. Her long hair fell in tangled waves over her face, casting shadows that obscured her features. The only sound was his own breath, harsh and loud in the quiet room. "Anna," he called softly, stepping further inside. Slowly she looked up, her eyes meeting his, and he felt his heart skip a beat. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow, dark circles shadowing her cheeks. She looked at him, but it was as if she were seeing something far beyond him, something that filled her with a fear he couldn't begin to understand. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," he replied, his voice shaking slightly. "I got your letter. You asked for help." Her gaze drifted to the space beside him, as though something invisible stood just behind his shoulder. "It's here," she murmured, her voice trembling. "It's always here, watching. It follows me everywhere." Peter's skin prickled with a deep sense of unease, but he kept his voice steady. "Anna, what exactly do you see?" She shook her head, her eyes wide, filled with terror. "You can't see it," she whispered. "None of you can. But I know it's there. I feel it. In the walls. In the shadows. Waiting for me." He wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was only in her mind, but something about her gaze, her voice, made him hesitate. "Do you know what it wants?" he asked softly. Her lips trembled and she looked back at him, her expression one of pure, unfiltered dread. "It wants me to remember," she said, "to see the things I've forgotten." He felt a strange chill crawl up his spine, as though some deep, hidden part of him recognized the words. "What things, Anna?" She didn't answer, her gaze drifting back to the empty space beside him, her face growing even paler. "It's right behind you." A chill ran down his spine, every instinct screaming at him to turn, to look, but he forced himself to remain still, to keep his focus on Anna. Slowly he reached for her hand, wanting to anchor her, to reassure her that she wasn't alone. But the moment he touched her, she vanished. His hand fell through empty air, his heart pounding as he looked around, disoriented. The room was empty. The bed, the chair, everything was gone, as though they had never been there. His flashlight flickered, the beam casting erratic shadows across the walls, and he realized with growing horror that he was no longer in room 306. The walls around him were different, tighter, closer, the wallpaper peeling in places to reveal the bare, crumbling plaster underneath. A faint whisper echoed through the darkness, filling the room, pressing against his ears. He turned, his flashlight barely illuminating the cramped, suffocating space. He took a step forward, his heart pounding, and froze. A figure stood in the corner, its outline barely visible, shrouded in shadows. It was tall, thin, its limbs twisted, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes dark and empty, staring at him with a cold, unfeeling gaze. A low whisper echoed through the room, filling his mind, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Remember me." The words sent a chill through him, his skin prickling with a dread so deep it left him breathless. He backed away, his flashlight flickering, the figure's gaze following him, piercing through him. And then the room began to shift, the walls closing in, pressing down on him, trapping him in a space that felt smaller and smaller with each passing second. He turned, trying to find a way out, but there was no door, no escape. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing over and over. "Remember me." The room was shrinking, the walls pressing against him, the air growing colder, thinner. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, the flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. And in the darkness he felt it, the cold, unyielding presence pressing against him, filling his mind, his thoughts, until there was nothing left but shadows. He knew in that moment that he was no longer alone. The last patient had claimed him,